Hello, welcome. My name is SlugMTG, and today I'm going over 5 tips on how to build more resilient decks. What's the point in a more resilient deck? It's all about consistency. The more consistent your deck is, the more fun you're going to have, since I don't think sitting there, drawing a card, and passing is all that much fun. Hopefully you guys can learn from my past deck building mistakes and avoid those awkward moments where you realize you didn't put a single card draw spell in your entire deck. So, without further ado, tip number 1, building with purpose. The first thing you should know when you sit down to build a commander deck is who your commander is. Pretty obvious. The second is what direction you're taking the deck. What this means is knowing what your win condition is and how you're going to get there. When you pull this deck out to play, you should be able to summarize what you're going to want to do in 1 or 2 sentences. If your game plan summary is sounding more like an essay, odds are you're pulling the deck in way too many different directions. The first thing I personally think about once I've decided on a commander is how I'm going to win. Once I've settled on the main win condition, I build the deck around that strategy and how I'm going to get there. A pitfall I see a lot with newer players is cramming too many cards that are just meant to be cool and fun, but not much else. I know, it's ironic, taking out fun cards when you're trying to have fun, but in my experience, your time is going to be so much more enjoyable piloting a deck that feels tuned and focused versus the 1 in 10 games that you're actually going to be able to pull off your 7-card combo. Speaking of tuned and focused, that leads us right into our next tip. Tip number 2, staying on track. Once you have the core idea to build around, it's time to put in the cards to make that happen. However, once you start adding cards for that strategy, it's important to keep that goal in mind. Let's say you're building an Orzhov token deck, so you put in a Soul Warden. Alright, makes sense. You're making a lot of tokens, and Soul Warden is going to gain you life for each token you put out. So, now that you're gaining a lot of life, you put in Aetherflux Reservoir. Not only is Aetherflux Reservoir going to gain you even more life, it now turns that life you're getting into its very own win condition. It's perfect. Except, you get into a game, you draw Aetherflux Reservoir, and Soul Warden is nowhere to be seen. Now, Aetherflux Reservoir is a powerful card, but your deck isn't built to abuse it, so it's going to feel really bad to play. Only gaining you minimal life, and the table is probably going to freak with the Death Star on the field, and now you're dead. The problem started when the focus of your deck, making tokens, stopped being the focus of your decision making. A separate branch of life gain was created from the main idea of token generation, and the further down the branch you go, the further and further it gets from the core idea. Now, the idea might seem good on paper, like the example above, but Magic is a game of RNG, and being able to play around a random group of cards from a larger collection you've put together becomes much easier when a majority of them are trying to do the same thing. The more branches someone creates in their deck, the less likely 2 cards are going to work well together. My general rule of thumb is, if a card doesn't contribute towards the main strategy, it has to at least work well with it, and even then, I try to limit the amount of pure synergy cards to a minimum. Soul Warden is fine in a token deck, since the more tokens you put down, the more life you'll gain, but Aetherflux Reservoir doesn't belong in that list because it doesn't synergize with the tokens directly. So if you don't pull the Soul Warden, it's essentially a dead card, and I'd much rather have an Anointed Procession. Unfortunately, I can't give the magic number that will guarantee your deck works perfectly because it doesn't exist. It depends greatly on your individual deck, what strategy you're running, what role your commander plays in all this, and I could go on. Keep the main strategy in mind at all times, try to remember which cards just sat in your hand all game last time you played, and I promise your deck will be running better in no time. Tip number 3. Redundancy is key. Since Commander is a singleton format, you're much less likely to run into the same cards every match. Now, I believe this is a good thing, as it means each game will be different, even if it's with the same decks, but it can be quite the obstacle when deck building. Sometimes the RNG is just brutal, and no matter how much you believe in the heart of the cards, you're not going to get the draws you want. This is why tutors are very powerful in Commander, as they can be any card in your deck, but what if the card you want is in your graveyard or exile? Well, now you're screwed. Might as well go home. Wait, that's right. You remembered you also put these other 2 cards that do the exact same thing, and now the day is saved. Having multiple cards that do the same thing can be a lifesaver, increasing the odds of drawing into the effect you're looking for or replacing a card that was answered by your opponents earlier. Even if the effect is on your commander, the one card you're going to see every game, we all have those games where your commander just can't seem to stick. It gets eliminated time and time again, and now you have to pay 47 mana just to put it down. Sometimes, however, there's only one card with the effect you're looking for, and now it's time to look for another way to do what you want. For the sake of an example, let's take a look at Cedrus the Traitor King. Cedrus is pretty unique with his effect, giving each creature card in our graveyard unearthed, meaning we can pay 2 and a black to bring the creature from the graveyard to the battlefield, but it's exiled at the end of the turn or when it leaves the battlefield, whichever comes first. Let's just say you have a graveyard full of creatures, but no one is letting you keep Cedrus on the field. The second you play him, he's put right back into the command zone. Unfortunately for us, there's literally no other card in Magic's history that has that effect. However, the goal of the deck is to bring creatures back from the graveyard, so if we have a few straight recursion cards in our deck, like Victimize, Animate Dead, and Reanimate, we can at least still have a few options to fall back on until we can safely land Cedrus. Having these redundant effects around key ideas we want to achieve can really help ensure we can do what we want to do, even if a key piece is removed. Tip number 4, never run empty. I don't know about you, but I think it's one of the worst feelings in Magic to be sitting there twiddling your thumbs because you can't do anything. Whether it's because you're getting mana screwed, running out of cards, or low on any resource you normally want to have, we have to plan on ways to get more. For the early game, this means having more mana available to us sooner. Whether by ramping into more lands, playing artifacts, or whatever else we can do, the more mana we can get our hands on, the further ahead we'll be of our opponents, and the more powerful turns we can have to propel ourselves to victory. In addition to ramp, every deck is going to need some form of card advantage. In most decks this will be card draw, but depending on various strategies, this can be grabbing cards from your graveyard, from exile, or whatever you want to do. The important thing is that you're refilling your hand and making sure that you're not running out of cards to play. I can't stress the importance of card advantage enough. For me personally, this is one of the hardest things for me to notice. Each game I was playing cards that were doing their job and felt really good to play, but I would run out of cards in my hand way before anybody else. And it wasn't until I started adding that card advantage that I was able to close out games a lot easier. Each color can have their own way of gaining card advantage, so make sure you're looking into those ways and incorporating them into your decks. If you can make sure you're ramping in the early game and constantly holding a handful of cards, you're ensuring that your deck is going to get rolling and have no shortage of options available to you, and believe me, it's a great feeling. Tip number 5, have answers. This is probably the most common problem I see for newer players. They have their game plan, all their cards are sticking to that plan, they're ramping early, keeping their hand full, but when someone else's strategy starts to go off, there's nothing they can do. A part of ensuring that your deck can run without a hitch is making sure that your opponents aren't getting in your way. You want to make sure to have a wide variety of answers, ranging from eliminating creatures, artifacts, and enchantments off the board to hosing entire strategies with graveyard hate. Another thing to keep in mind is to have a variety of ways to be able to answer those threats. For instance, if we have a Yarok the Desecrated deck, we obviously like Enter the Battlefield abilities, so we'll be running Reclamation Sage and a couple cards like it. However, if that's all we're running and an opponent plays Torpor Orb, we're just dead in the water. There's no way we can answer that. So not only do we want to be able to stop our opponents from going off, we also have to think about how our opponents will try to shut our deck down. Finding out which answers to put in our deck can be one of the more challenging parts since they're not really dependent on our core strategy. However, if you have a consistent play group, this can be made a bit easier, as you want to lean towards answers for the decks you'll be playing up against the most. If a couple of your friends really like playing out of their graveyard, then putting in a couple more graveyard hate cards can only benefit you by consistently slowing them down. If you don't play with the same people a lot, then just make sure to have a good variety and you should be fine. After all, there's 2 other players that can help you take one person down if they get out of hand. So there are my 5 tips to help you build more resilient decks. If you follow these guidelines, then I guarantee you'll be seeing an improvement. I learned these through trial and error, and that's really what it's about. That being said, everyone has their own playstyle, and if you find that a couple of my tips aren't cutting it for you, then feel free to experiment. If you're struggling or worrying about having the golden ratio, the difficult part is that there is no perfect answer. Just build the deck and keep a critical eye for cards that don't perform or things you may be missing consistently. You'll get there, I promise. I hope this video was a decent resource for you, and I would love to hear any additional questions or general feedback down in the comments below. As always, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to watch my video. I really do appreciate it. But now, if you'll excuse me, I'm about to make some new friends with my brand new Derevi Stacks deck. Bye!